The 2020 Minority Health Film Festival offers a diverse variety of films and events that we just wouldn't be able to offer in the in-person cinema experience. But I think what really makes it unique is the focus not only on public health issues, but the issues that really concern communities of color. If you're looking for a reason to engage or to try it out, this is the perfect time. Just go to mkefilm.org/MHFF.
Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Sherry Try. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Frederick the Medical College of Wisconsin, but also am honored to serve as a founding member of Elevation, which is an organization that helps elevate the visibility of Asian American issues, businesses, and professionals in our community. I'm really glad that you could join us today. This is the last day of the Minority Health Film Festival. And we're really honored to be a part of it, but don't worry, you still have time. You still have several hours to watch the films and catch up this evening to engage in some of the other festival events. You can go to milwaukeefilm.org/MHFF to learn more. So today we are going to be talking about the model minority myth. The topic of today is how racial stereotypes contribute to the mental health issues in the Asian American community. And I'm super fortunate to have joining me today some professionals and professionals in the mental health field in Wisconsin. So I want to introduce to you my esteemed panel today. Starting off, Paulina Lim is joining us. Paulina is a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Welcome, Paula. Thank you, Paulina. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We also have today Lauren Chaling Mascari, who is a pre-doctoral intern at Rogers Behavioral Health Child and Adolescent Day Treatment. Hi, Lauren. Thank you for joining.
Hi.
We also have with us today Dr. David Sonko. David is a licensed psychologist, certified group psychotherapist, and owner of New Insights LLC, also an assistant professor at the Wisconsin School of Professional Psychology. Thank you, Dr. David Sonko, for joining us today. And then also we have joining us via phone, if she can, join parts of our conversation, Gao-Chi Wang, who is the assistant director at Iris Place, which is a peer-run mental health respite in the Fox Valley. So thank you, Gao-Chi, for joining us as well.
Thank you for
having me. Thank you. So we would like to get started today. You know, we were discussing a film that was part of the Milwaukee Minority Health Film Festival called The Ugly Model. And that film documented the experience of a Korean adoptee who is pursuing a career in the professional modeling industry and coming to terms with just his own perception of himself and his esteem as he pursued that career. So it brought up a lot of questions for us. You know, it's not lost on us that the theme of today's topic is model minority, and we're talking about a model pursuing a career in the modeling industry. So it's kind of a little play on words there. But the theme, model minority, and what that means, right? We've probably heard this term, not everybody, but a lot of us have probably heard the theme of what a model minority is. And that's kind of followed our Asian American population for quite a long time. Now that myth includes the perception that Asian Americans are docile, they're obedient, they're high performing, successful, intelligent, don't really cause trouble. You know, they're very polite. All of those kinds of things that they consider a model minority. And it's definitely been used as kind of a divisive tool to pit, you know, different ethnicities against each other and putting them at odds as far as one being better than another. But what else that model minority myth does is it creates these stereotypes, right, of what people perceive Asian Americans to be. And that creates, you know, certain perceptions in the mind of other, white Americans or other ethnic groups about who we are as Asian Americans, but it also impacts how we think about ourselves, I think, too. So, thinking about these stereotypes, what kind of harm do these model minority stereotypes cause for Asian Americans? And, David, I'll start with you.
Great way to put me on the spot right away. The stereotypes that, are kind of placed on Asian Americans, it sets a level of expectation. As soon as they say like, oh, what do you do? Are you a doctor or a nurse, right? If you're looking at specifically at different kind of Asian cultures, or you must be successful, or like there makes these assumptions about you. And on the internalized level, the individual begins a sense of comparison, the comparison of oneself to this kind of notion of what is it then that other people are expecting about me. If they don't meet that expectation or not rising to perceptions, if you will, that can immediately create a sense of internalized shame.
Mm-hmm. So that shame, Lauren, tell me a little bit more about, what can contribute to that feeling of shame? What are some of those, perceptions or some of those things that are creating that sense of shame?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of the biggest challenges with being a model minority, like Dr. Sango was saying, is just this really high expectation, which is not always realistic. We're not really robots, we're people, so we do make mistakes, we do need help ourselves. And so it can really kind of place an invisible barrier between reaching out for help, or you might start having really low self-esteem because you're like, oh, I'm supposed to be, at the top of the charts, when you can't function like that all the time every day. So you might experience a lot of internalized symptoms of just having that poor self-esteem, negative thoughts about yourself, just like David was saying, comparing yourself in a really unrealistic way.
Mm-hmm. So how does that kind of manifest in like a mental health kind of disorder or some issues? Paulina, what kinds of issues do people present with then in terms of mental health if they're dealing with some of this shame, this cultural shame?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, first and foremost, there's this negative, kind of what we call it, negative self-talk of seeing yourself in this really negative light of, I should be better, I could do better, this is what is expected of me. And that, negative self-talk could really take a toll on someone because you're constantly beating yourself down. And it could manifest potentially as depression, right? Like that you're thinking of yourself as someone who is unable to, although you want to. It could also present as anxiety, that you're conscious and always thinking about and always wondering, what could I do better? What could I be better? And that anxiety is also harmful in many ways. I mean, anxiety and depression, those are two examples of how it could manifest as mental health symptoms, but I'm sure there is a whole wide range because, as we know, in mental health, that having one, mental health condition is comorbid or associated with having other conditions, depending on how we cope, how we think about ourselves and how we interact with other people.
Right. And we hear that, if you let these, issues of like anxiety, for example, keep going on and keep building and building, they become physical, ailments as well. They manifest in terms of high blood pressure and hypertension and things like that as well, which actually is one of those disparities that does impact the Asian community more than others, hypertension and high blood pressure. So I'm wondering if there is some kind of connection there between like bottling in all this anxiety and manifesting in terms of health disparities. So thank you for sharing that feedback. So what else, aside from like this model minority myth, are there things inherent to like just Asian culture in general that also contribute to, the mental health issues in our community? Are there things that are not necessarily imposed upon us by stereotypes, but actually cultural norms and habits and customs? What kinds of things might contribute to that as well? Anyone have a comment on that?
Yeah, I have a quick comment on that one. So the one thing that I've really noticed within our community, specifically in the Hmong community, is that I always say mental health is kind of a non-existent concept, because there is no word for mental health in a specific language, even in the Hmong language. So when you're trying to describe mental health to elders, or just like even like to your own parents who might be a little bit more traditional than you are, there is a automatic disconnect, because honestly the word that we use when we discuss mental health is actually translated to possess. So that in of itself carries a stigma, because now it's just not even about their mental well-being. It's a whole nother layer of trying to break through the fact that I'm not this. I'm just like trying to work through my emotional feelings and such. So I guess the one thing that is so difficult with cultural cultural considerations is that sometimes mental health is not an existing concept. And when you are using that, or when you have that in addition to the culture you live in, it's like a double-edged sword that really just kind of digs people deeper into depression or anxiety or symptoms that also speaks to intergenerational trauma too.
Great, thank you, Gauchis. Yeah, absolutely. The stigma, the fact that it's, I think what you're saying, since there's not even a word to describe mental health in a lot of our cultural languages, just goes to show how far back it's been kind of deemed as non-existent, right? They don't even have a word for it. So how can we address something that we can't even name? So I think that's part of, what I've learned is that, if it's out of sight, out of mind, you don't talk about it. It's not something that you talk about with your family. It's not something you talk about, whether it's, something that is considered so private or, shameful that you don't share that. David, did you have a comment to share?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I would want to almost expand this a bit too, right? Because, we're talking about kind of mental health and even mental health diagnoses from a Western colonized lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depression and anxiety are the DSM-5 terminology for diagnosing. And I really want us to examine, right? Like, mental health doesn't have to meet a threshold of criteria. I mean, if we take a look at the film, we can see that there's just a struggle, right? A struggle with identity that was creating a level of distress. I mean, that is a mental health kind of like struggle. That is a condition. We may not be able to diagnose it, but it's something that I think, as Asian Americans, identity struggles. We talk about shame. So when there's shame, the other kind of balance of that is like authentic living, like trying to be yourself, trying to figure out who you are, this kind of identity crisis and living in that authentic way. We have, I think, to widen the scope of what mental perhaps health or even mental wellness really might mean for this population.
If I may, with that, I would add just the idea of stress. I have found is one way to start those conversations with people who are not comfortable or not accustomed to the language that we use around mental health in the profession, because almost everybody experiences stress. So that's like a more comfortable word to really start that conversation. So, even if you're watching and you're thinking to yourself like, oh, I have this kind of stress, or I'm stressed about this, that in other terms is just name something else when really we're talking about the same thing.
Right. And I just wanted to remind the audience, if you do have questions to add as well, we do have the chat. So please submit any questions there and we'll address those as soon as we can. But want to touch on another topic. I think also we saw in the film, and also, as an Asian American, and I think every Asian American that I know or have come across or have, had the conversation with has experienced some form of bullying in their childhood, right? Because of how you look, if you look different, or, maybe the food that you eat, the clothes that you wear, all of those things. Like, bullying is something that I think is common to all Asian Americans. And it was common for Kevin in this film, Ugly Model. He experienced bullying in school as well. So, bullying in general impacts youth from all different generations, all different genres, all different races, right? But specifically with the Asian American culture, how does bullying impact, the experiences that people have identifying as Asian American as adults, and just that relationship with their identity as they get older? How does that impact them? David, can you start us off?
Well, how does it impact? We can say that it's loaded, right? What we know from bullying in general, right, is what are people generally bullied for? Well, it's part of a sense of appearance. They're often bullied for how they might be perceived, or they might be bullied for how they look. For Asian Americans, and I'll also speak to my own experience of being bullied, in the way that I grew up, it wasn't until I was bullied that I was faced with my cultural identity. I grew up in a predominantly white town. I kind of grew up stereotypically white, and in many ways, I didn't see myself as different. And so for some Asian American youth, they may have a very similar experience to me, in which that might be their first encounter with being different. When we recognize the sense of difference, it almost becomes a level of acculturation, even if we were born here, in which we have to decide, how do we kind of rectify? Do we own that piece of ourselves? Do we reject the piece of ourselves? Or how do we then negotiate that? And to ask a high schooler, a grade schooler, a fourth grader to begin tackling those things creates, again, this level of unnecessary stress that can really, negatively impact our overall mental health. Add that in to then family dynamics and also parental responses to the bullying. Depending on how that support group responds to the bullying, can also have some ramifications for the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Great. So when it comes to like bullying, and when you talk about, it's appearance based, we see a lot of, Asian Americans as they get older or old enough seeking plastic surgery or seeking ways to change their looks because they feel that that's what was the cause of their ostracization or their bullying, was just because of, hey, because my eyes look a certain way, or my hair is a certain color, or not a certain color. I mean, I think as you identified, David, as a child, I didn't know that I was going to stay looking like this my whole life. I thought I was going to change. I grew up and be blonde haired and blue eyed. I had no idea that this was a permanent look for me. But, a lot of people do try to take their own looks then into their own hands, right? And we saw that in the film as well, that Kevin underwent eyelid surgery, double eyelid surgery, and maybe some others as well. So how do we see like that impacting, self-esteem, as adults as well? Any comments on that, Paulina or Lauren?
Yeah, I think it definitely impacts self-esteem. And I let me speak briefly about the bullying aspect of things. And I almost think, the bullying might stop when you're in high school, but I think that bullying extends even when you're an adult. It might not necessarily be called bullying, but there is definitely experience of isolation, of othering, even among your work setting, even among university settings. And that's very much present, and that very much affects Asian Americans, even in adulthood, and that othering is harmful. So in terms of thinking about body image and body ideals and what that would look like, I think there are differences in how Asian men and Asian American men and Asian American women perceive body image. And I think the one that we saw for Kevin in The Ugly Model is kind of this ideal of being strong, of being muscular, of having double eyelids. And I remember even as a child, a lot of my family members would tape their eyelids so that they would have the double lids. You don't have to go through surgery, but they've developed ways so that you could get that double eyelid because that's a better ideal. And now I think in terms of women having this ideal of being really slim and being, can you hear me okay?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Being really slim and pursuing this ideal body shape is also really harmful, and it could impact, again, the way you think about yourself, the way you interact with others, because it might prevent you from going out, socializing, and finding the support that you might need.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, Gauchi, I know that if you're able to answer, that you actually wrote a book not too long ago called Building Walls to Break Down. And that was a collection of writings and poetry that really talked about self-love and self-acceptance. Can you tell me a little bit more about what inspired that and how that can tie into this topic as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I will jump right back to what Dr. Sanko said on his personal experience. I think that's what really was the foundation to my book. A lot of me growing up was assimilating with the world around me and believing that I looked like everybody else, but I wasn't. Because I was always the one to be the spokesperson for all Asian people, even though I don't even know myself, to be honest. I've been called whitewash or banana. Those were very common things for me to hear, and they came from my Asian identity, my Asian community. It came from them because they never saw me as one of them, but I was never also somebody with my white friends. So growing up, it was a battle, and it still is today when I reflect on it, not because now I don't know who I am, but almost because I have to unlearn everything I have learned growing up. And so that's why I titled my book that way, because I'm building walls to break down, because growing up, you build these walls, you're assimilating, you're being people you're being a person that you're not even going to grow up to be proud of. But that's because at the time it was almost survival. It's like a survival instinct to be like everybody else, so that you wouldn't stand out, so that you wouldn't be the oddball any more than you already are. So you do everything you can to be like everyone else around you. And then to break down, that part was I really wanted to dig deeper into when you start realizing like my cultural identity, my Hmong identity, my Asian identity, that all makes me who I am. And I think the brain is so powerful that even growing up, you can look in the mirror and still say, oh, I look like I am white. Even though in the mirror, you're clearly not. But that's so psychological, because a big part of it has to do with acceptance, but you can't learn to accept until you see who you actually are. And this book really works through that. And this book just really spoke to the thoughts that I had growing up.
Great. Thank you, Gauchi, for sharing that. And again, that book's title was Building Walls to Break Down. So if you get a chance to check that out, I would recommend taking a look at that. So, going back to, what we saw in this film, The Ugly Model, right? We saw a lot of, changes, I think, in the main character, or the main, subject of the documentary, Kevin Kreider, right, as a model, just really kind of constantly kind of comparing himself to others, or kind of trying to see if he's better than, or, less than somebody else. And it was a constant, again, comparing, which is kind of, what is that? The robbing, the thief of joy is comparison, right? We say that, or see that a lot, that he really wasn't able to appreciate the positive things that he experienced, or even the success that he was having as a model, because it wasn't as successful as somebody else, right? And I think, one of the interesting things that maybe not everyone, but in the Asian culture, we get to a lot by our parents, right? Like, how come you can't be like, David, or like, how come you can't be like so-and-so's son or daughter, right? So comparison is definitely something we're familiar with in our own culture. One of the things that stuck out to me in the film was how the parents, because he's an adoptee from Korea, his parents actually tried to, as Gauchi was saying, she was trying to hide her own culture. They actually kind of didn't even share his own Asian background with him. They just felt like if you treat him like everybody else, he's going to be like everybody else. So let's just treat him like he is a white kid in his school. But what they neglected to realize is that not everybody will treat him like everybody else, right? Like it's definitely a challenge there. One of the things that comes out when we talk about appearance is, we're in this era of COVID-19 right now. And we have seen a lot of xenophobia against the Asian community. So it really puts an interesting spin on that model minority myth, right? Whether are we actually, model citizens, or are we a threat? I think we've heard the term pet or threat thrown out as far as, the different perceptions that people may have about the Asian community. So talk to me a little bit, Lauren, about xenophobia, the impact of the xenophobia that people are experiencing today, how that is damaging or impacting our Asian communities.
Yeah, I think that our social climate right now is really tumultuous, to say the least. So in addition to just the social justice issues and movements that we're seeing and finally getting highlighted in the media, there are negative things that are also potentially problematic or, a threat to our own safety, like our own body. I think it didn't become real for me until I actually saw a face of like someone who was slashed across the cheek when they were shopping in a Walmart with their child. And so that really brought to light just how strongly people are reacting right now, and is really even like all the more reason to have education around what's actually going on with COVID. Like, how does it actually work? Just because I look this way doesn't mean I have it. I'm wearing a mask for your protection and mine, not just because you're assuming I have it. So I think just basic education about why are people doing the things they're doing would be helpful.
All right. Paulina, what are your thoughts? What are some of the ways that that xenophobia could be impacting people?
I think it's this idea of conditionality. I think, like you mentioned, Sherry, xenophobia has happened and is part of American history. Ever since they brought the Chinese over to, help build that railroad, and then eventually they don't want them there. And there's this history, and I think that's also been erased in some ways from American history, that we don't talk about the xenophobia that's been happening and is now happening. And I think I link that to this idea of conditionality, like you mentioned, that it's either you're a model minority and you're okay, you could stay here until COVID happens, then you have to get out and you can't be here anymore.
Right.
And it's this idea of like, you're welcome, you're not really welcome. So it's this heightened uncertainty that creates this really stressful situation, because you don't know, am I welcome in this space or am I not welcome in this space? And how would I know if I'm welcome in that space or not?
Right.
On top of the health pandemic that is happening.
Yeah,
and like go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Yeah, and like you mentioned before, a lot of those stress responses is really impacting how our body is working. And in the middle of a pandemic, when it is respiratory illness, like that makes it a little bit harder, and that makes it a little bit harder for your body to do whatever it's supposed to do to protect itself.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that what I was going to mention after your comment really sparked a thought in me is that you never know how quickly that you go from being a model minority to a threat. It happened so quickly with COVID, almost overnight, just a couple of people saying, Asian flu or Chinese virus, and all of a sudden, anyone who possibly could even remotely be Chinese or associated with Chinese culture was labeled as a threat and was identified as a danger and treated, horribly in a lot of cases, as you said, Lauren, even with violence. So hearing a lot of stories of people afraid to go out to the stores or afraid to interact with people or just really being a heightened sense of fear, that manifesting in certain mental health issues, whether it be paranoia or, agoraphobia or all these different things that could be impacting people's daily lives as well. So it's just such an interesting twist to how, something like a virus, can snowball and tap into people's fears and create such a kind of snowball effect when it comes to, Asian culture as well. So we have a question that came up, I think sparked by Gauchi's comment about whitewashing and assimilation, right? We've when we're bullied, we just want to fit in. That's part of, I think, Asian culture, that collectivism of Asian culture. Just we want to be a part of a group, and that in-group status is very important. We want to belong. I mean, I think that's true of almost every individual. You want to belong, but with Asian culture, it's incredibly strong, that sense of collectivism. So when we talk about assimilation and whitewashing, how do you think that plays out in corporate America and in other organizations? How do we see that showing up there?
Can I come in really quick?
Yes, gotcha, sure.
Yeah, so one thing that I really want to say with other organization or corporate America is it kind of goes also about what we just talked about, how this model minority, we push ourselves to even be more, but then there's this bamboo ceiling where you can only hit so high until you can't go anymore. And in other words, then the model minority itself comes back to hurt us. And it just kind of showcases the fact that the model minority was never there to make us a model. It was there to weaponize community so that the white-centric perspective was still in front of us. So I know some people who have worked in corporate America, and they really struggled with, and they were women. So that also brings the gender, the deep gender issues as well. And when you really try to balance all that with being whitewashed on top of corporate America, on top of being a woman, it's a lot against you. And as much as you are an asset to the company or to the organization, you're really just being utilized as somebody to push the organization forward without giving you your actual value.
All right. Now, thinking about that as well, Gauchi, that's a great mention of the bamboo ceiling, right? We talk about, there's a lot of representation of Asian Americans in corporate America, but not at that leadership level, right? There's some perception that, that model minority, like you said, comes back to bite you, where, you're submissive, you're docile, you're polite. Those aren't qualities that people consider leadership qualities, right? So that kind of comes back to where we're considered very technically capable, but not leaders. So that's something that is a myth as well, because I know a lot of really strong Asian American leaders in this community that are continuing to push the conversation forward. So would challenge that. One of the other things I'd like to discuss with this group is around those other perceptions. How do those stereotypes form? It's not just about that model minority myth, but where it gets perpetuated, right? Thinking about the media, thinking about Hollywood, thinking about, what we see on television. Where are some of those places that, we could make an impact in changing what that narrative is for Asian Americans? David, I see the wheels turning in David's eyes there. So I'd like to start with you.
You always come to me, Sherry, and I appreciate it. And at the same time, I'm trying to turn out, right? Because, when you say media, our media platforms in the last 15 years it's incredible how much they have changed. So would I love to see more Asian representation in Hollywood? Absolutely. Right. But I think also more importantly, I want to see more Asian representation on kind of general television, in general. I want to see more Asians representing us in leadership positions. I want to see more Asians representing me in government positions and civic positions. I want to see more Asians on the city and county level. Like, I want to be able to see, like, I want to be able to tell my children, like, look, like this is what we are here, right? We are here, and this is kind of what we offer, and this is how we participate in the community. To see, I think, to go back to the original question, right? Like, how do some of these other perception of us perpetuate? Part of it, I think, is media. The other part of it, I think, is just out of plain fear, right? That if somebody has an encounter or hears of an encounter, that it can create a fear in the individual to then perpetuate what then becomes a belief or a stereotype. I mean, how many of us on this panel, right, had a joke like, "Oh, you must be so good at math," right?
And I'm not.
Does anyone know where that actually came from?
Mm-mm.
Like, I don't even know where that came from, but it's something that at some point somebody saw it was funny. Maybe they believed it was true. Maybe they'd had an Asian in their class actually get a better grade than them. And then they can't attribute it to the work and skill, but rather they have to attribute it to a cultural background and identity as then being unfair, right? So there's something about it that then is fear-based that perpetuates these perceptions.
Mm-hmm. Lauren, Paulina?
I think one aspect of just being like quote unquote docile is that you're not asserting yourself. You're not speaking up. You're not going for the position because you're giving space for others. You're you're doing the right thing. You're people pleasing. And so I think those are some of the challenges too, whether they're internalized or whether they're in other systems. I think a lot of systemic oppression is problematic. But then also, what are we doing as individuals to kind of push those boundaries, to have those conversations, to really shift what are those stereotypes? What does it mean to be assertive and not aggressive in a respectful way, where it's like you can still be like a reasonable person, but maybe it's not fitting a stereotype that someone has about you. So I think those are some of the challenges that I've experienced internally, like, oh, what do I do here? But also systemically, these are problems that need to be addressed.
I think, when I go back to media and just some of the struggles that, that Kevin has had in his documentary about his own, his role, wanting to be seen as attractive, and, seeing a lot of movies that we've seen in Hollywood have not had, Asian lead males in the roles of like even a romantic lead, until we saw films like Crazy Rich Asians or Always Be My Maybe. And those two films really showed us that, we've got Henry Golding, we've got, Randall Park, we've got these guys that can play romantic leads and be successful in them. And these movies can make millions of dollars worldwide. But, we haven't seen this all of a sudden influx of a bunch of Asian male leads after that happened, right? I mean, those were a couple of films that were successful, but it took so long before we even got there. Most of the lead, if you ever saw an Asian male in a film, he was either, a karate expert, Yakuza or something, or a computer nerd of some sort, right? Like, it was always those stereotypical roles that aren't considered necessarily, the attractive romantic, perception that really helps. It puts our Asian men in a box, right? I also saw a study about online dating algorithms and what the most successful people and least successful people on dating apps were. And Asian men were among the bottom in terms of success in matching with other people. So these kinds of stereotypes actually impact people's behaviors and actually impact people's interactions as well. So when you kind of get all of those signals and cues from society, how do you think that, shows up as far as male ego and, male self-esteem in the Asian community?
I like that you brought up the dating app sharing. It makes me recall back to my bachelor days of the number of times that I would come across a profile that said, 6 foot or above. Like there's no time in my life that I will be more than 6 feet tall, right? And it's one of those things though where there it creates again an internalized perception of what we then believe is desirable, and then also then what we are not, right? You want 6 foot, I am not 6 foot, therefore I am now undesirable to you. Even though that is not necessarily the direct link, that is what then subconsciously creates a belief, right? It's like, these are what you want, this is what I am not, therefore I am undesirable, as opposed to simply stating, I am undesirable to you, right? It becomes
That's a very
more broad, more
clear
generalized,
distinction.
which then negatively impacts self-esteem.
Yeah, that's a very great distinction to make, right? That we ourselves are stereotyping ourselves by saying, well, this is what everybody must think of me versus, this is an individual experience. And that's something we all can learn from. So, we're talking about mental health impacts in the Asian American community, right? All of these social cues, whether it be media, whether it be, these myths and these stereotypes from society. So what do we see? I mean, in your experience, you're all professionals in the mental health field. Do you think that mental health awareness is taking root in the Asian American community? Are people getting the help? Are there more people seeking mental health support, in your opinion? What do you think? Lauren, what are your thoughts?
Sherry, I wish I could say yes, because I think mental wellness is good for everyone. And, I'm working with primarily kids and families, and I don't really think I can recount working with an Asian kid here. So that's not to say that there aren't Asian kids that have mental health needs. It's just saying they're not here. So there's certainly a gap in accessing that care, or maybe it's just the approach that's not appropriate or not really congruent with the family's needs or what they're looking for. So I wish that everybody who needed something was able to access that in a reasonable amount of time too, because that can further kind of become this spiral if you're not really able to kind of catch stuff and then work on it with other coping skills or supports and things like that.
Gauchi, a question for you. Since you're working on a peer-run mental health respite, what have you seen more Asian American clients seeking support at your organization?
Yeah, so no, definitely not, which is really unfortunate, but it's also the truth in that it really speaks to the fact that the mental health resources we have out here, they really are not catered to specific communities. In other words, the access itself is the barrier. Like if you think about a school or even the warm line, I run a warm line with my peer run respite. From my understanding, Asian communities have no knowledge even, or didn't even know there was a warm line. And it's because the warm line itself, when it started, it was never put out there to minority communities. So it's not always that Asian people are not coming to find mental health resources, but it's because these resources are not reaching out to them. So having that understanding really just personally for me pushes me to find more resources that take that extra step to reach out to communities who are often left behind. And that also goes back to what Lauren said is, it's not that they don't have mental health needs, it's the fact that they do, it's just not given to them or easily accessible to them. Because if you go to, or like if you think about even school, and children or even high schoolers, any age, when you are discussing mental health and mental illness, you can go to your counselor. That counselor probably won't look like you. And then that in of itself would stop an individual from even seeking help anymore after that, because there's no level of understanding, cultural understanding, cultural empathy or sympathy in any way. So that kind of plays a role in people just drawing back from even looking for more resources. And it doesn't help that these resources don't reach out to them either.
Mm-hmm. Great, Gauchi. Thank you. Paulina, I mean, we heard, I think everyone is wholeheartedly saying, yeah, people are not accessing, Asian Americans are not reaching out and getting the help that they need. What are some things that can help with that? I know Gauchi shared a little bit of like, we need to reach out and get to people. What other tactics might we try to employ to reach out to the Asian community and help them get the help they need?
That's a really great question, especially because, like Lauren and Dr. Sanko and Gauchi has mentioned, mental health and mental wellness is really important for Asian American communities. I think there's one aspect of reaching out to Asian American communities, and then the other aspect is, what about the Asian Americans who are accessing, who are going and seeking out these services, and how are they treated when they ask for mental health? And as we know, the perception, the idea of mental health spreads from one person to another. Among close friends, that could happen. Among siblings, that could happen. And I wonder, in some ways, if we shift how Asian Americans are treated within, among those who are already getting services, and get them the services that is culturally sensitive, culturally conscious, and appropriate, and a place that validates their experiences, their identity, their being in a very holistic way, would that shift people who are now willing to gain resource, who are willing to seek mental health services? Yeah.
Earlier on, we talked about, just the barrier of not really having the right words, like literally not having the right words to talk to our parents or our elders about mental health. So what are some things, Lauren, what do you think are things that people can do to talk to their family members about mental health? Like, as Paulina said, having to have that personal experience and sharing that with others. How do you approach that? Or what are some ways that people can talk to their family?
I think some of the most important things are to think about what is the language we're using and what is the language that we're comfortable with. Like I mentioned earlier, the word stress can open a whole conversation, especially when I'm talking to parents. Like, where's your stress at lately? Do you have supports? Asking those two questions, it's usually a whole conversation about mental health. I'm just not calling it mental health. So like I said, just using like everyday language to talk about, how are you doing? Sometimes that is leading to like, oh my gosh, I've been feeling so down, this just happened. And so you're getting the symptoms, you're getting the information without having to use clinical terms, which sometimes are stigmatized depending on the community. So I think just using like regular language can make that a lot more comfortable.
David, thank you for joining us again. Sorry you had some technical difficulties there. But, we talked a little bit about, how do we get more Asian Americans to access mental health care. And, Paulina talked about a little bit about, she got on the topic of concordance, right? About making sure that we have, therapists and psychologists who look like our Asian community. And, we have great representation of that on this call, but we do need more of that, right? Do you think concordance is a critical piece of, creating more comfort in mental health care?
I think that, concordance is a piece, definitely a critical piece, but I would also say the other piece is also enhancing kind of clinician cultural competence as well. While there may be a level of comfort in the initial access to care by seeing somebody who might like me, there is also something to be said about, like, if I can go to somebody who maybe doesn't look like me, are they competent enough to, build that level of understanding of, what my culture might be, or can they even develop a relationship enough to help me feel safe enough to even begin to discuss how my culture might actually be affecting me, or what are the unique factors of my identity that would affect the treatment relationship. But overall, like I would agree, we do need more Asian therapists. I think we also need, we need more therapists in general. Let's also say that, like that as well. But definitely, we do need more Asian therapists to help even promote a sense of like healthy normality of that seeing a therapist despite being, again, I even noticed my term, despite being Asian, right? Like, that even seeing a therapist while Asian is a normal experience.
Mm-hmm. Great. Gauchi, do you have some thoughts to add to this topic?
Yeah, just like really quick off of what Dr. Sanko just said and Paulina, is that when you're talking about a client and therapist relationship, or just being in that safe space with a counselor, it gets harder and it pushes people more away when they're in that safe space, and instead of expressing themselves, they have to explain themselves. Like explain their cultural background, explain why it's hard to talk to their parents, explain why this decision has to be made as a whole rather than just on an individual level. So opening that space and that understanding that you need to have accessible and therapists that look like all the communities that are in this country. Otherwise, you will constantly push minority communities into the corners, and they have no space to express themselves anymore because they're constantly explaining themselves. And and that was the one point I wanted to bring up.
Great, thank you for that. And I think, Paulina and Lauren, they all brought up, cultural competence as a key, right? And Gauchi just expressed that, the less we have to explain what we mean to somebody, the better, because then we can really get to the meat of what we need to talk about. The question around cultural empathy was brought up as well. So it's not just about caring, but it's also understanding, right? So what can we do to help address and improve cultural empathy and understanding in our broader community? What are some things that we can do?
My short answer is just learn more. If you're on the talk, you're trying to learn more about this particular topic, right? So there's tons of resources, there's other films, there's other books, there's other experts. Do what you can on your own end. And that's our responsibility as providers as well, is what research are we doing ourselves so that the onus is not on the client, it's not on the patient coming for care. We're doing that ahead of time. So by the time you get here, there are very few questions needed, because that time should be really focused on what are your needs versus what don't I know about your culture. Certainly there are stereotypes. So it's like we want to be careful about what assumptions are we making based on how this person identifies. But certainly if you have some base knowledge about who you're seeing, that is at least a point of reference for you so you can kind of move forward.
Okay, anyone else like to add to that?
I think I wanted to add this idea of kind of wanting to learn more, kind of what Lauren has mentioned, but this idea of cultural humility, of really, there could be some base knowledge, but also understanding that not all people who look like my client, for example, are the same people. We're different, we have different, and some of that cultural identity presents itself in different ways, and it could be more salient in different spaces. And so I think as providers and as therapists, there needs to be some want or some motivation to be humble in the ways we approach clients that we don't know where they're coming from, but we want to know. And that we will learn either, in our conversation during that therapy session, but also in our own time, where we learn about social issues that are happening, where we learn about the history that it might not impact that particular person, but it could. And I think balancing that idea of to what degree am I competent, and I don't necessarily think anyone can ever be competent culturally because there's so many things to learn, but balancing that with humility and empathy as well.
Well, I feel like I can speak for myself and maybe David and Gauchi that we're really excited about the future of the Asian American therapists that we're going to have in our community, with both you, Paulina and Lauren, joining those ranks soon. So good luck on your studies, especially. But I always like to end with, giving people some resources, right? So I'm going to ask each of you to share a resource around like what's available to help, with not just, there's a lot of issues that face the Asian American community. It could be the xenophobia, it could be, trauma from, there's a lot of like refugees coming to our community that are experiencing trauma, and we have PTSD issues around that, or even just the self-identity issues and the self-esteem issues. What resources are available to help people address some of the traumas and some of these mental health issues that they're facing today? And I will start with Dr. Sanko first.
Just one resource, right?
If you have more, won't stop you.
No, I mean, I guess my first recommendation or my first resource is one that is more general. If you have a student in school or in college, the offices on those campuses are priceless, specifically anything in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also university counseling services. Those are often, especially for Asian Americans, their first opportunity or their first encounter with mental health, but also their first opportunity to seek mental health services without their family necessarily knowing, because they get to do that on their own. So please seek out university counseling services if you have access to university. My second recommendation is there are many resources on the American Psychological Association website, specifically looking at Asian American mental health. So you can go to apa.org and do a search in Asian American mental health in their search box, and it'll pop up with some of the literature, resources, and ways to get connected.
Thank you. Gauchi, would you like to share a recommendation of a resource that you can share with our audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. I have two as well. So this one is the Warm Line that I talked about, and the number is Iris Place's Warm Line is 920-815-3217. And I wanted to share that because it is a space that you can just call somebody that will emotionally and mentally support you. It could literally be because you had a bad day, or you had an argument with your partner or your family member, or a lot of things are just weighing on your shoulders. You can just call someone and talk to them about it, and they will be there to listen and sit in the moment with you. And they're literally your peers at that time. They're called peer companions, and they're your peers because they understand that life gets hard and that our mental health isn't just, when we talk about mental health, it's not just mental illness, it's the stability of our mental health and how that goes up and down, because every single one of us has mental health. It's just how it looks like. And then my second one is, it goes back to how do you approach this with your family. I think a resource or a recommendation is go to somebody you trust. Go to somebody you trust who looks like you, because coming from a very collectivist culture, there's a lot of respect, especially with the older folks, and go and talk to your folks so that there's a level of respect up there. Then that will allow your narrative to go through without you feeling the weight of trying to talk to your parents, who might already automatically be like, oh, you're just being lazy, oh, you don't want to do this, etc., etc. And I think I wanted to add that because there are resources out there, but then there are things that we deserve to know that we can do as well on top of the resources around us.
Great. Thank you, Gauchi. Paulina, do you have a resource to share?
Yeah, I have two. I want to expand on what Gauchi has mentioned about reaching out to someone you trust, and also reaching out to other folks who come from BIPOC or minoritized backgrounds. because chances are experiences are similar, and that there are barriers and challenges to accessing mental health. It might not be the exact same thing, but it could, create that relationship that someone is also hearing what I'm experiencing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who looks exactly like you, but someone who might have a shared history, or someone who might have shared lived experiences, might be helpful, and just opens a door to being able to talk about what you're experiencing. And like Lauren has mentioned, what stress you're experiencing at that moment. And the other one that I want to share is, because we're in the time of COVID, there is access to video and telehealth. I don't necessarily have any specific, recommendations of telehealth options, but it's there. And I think that might help folks access mental health that wouldn't normally have access to, especially if it's from a different state. But I don't know how that might work, depending on the state. So.
Great, thank you. And Lauren.
Yes, I'm sorry if I missed if David already shared NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness. That's a great support for families, especially who maybe are talking about mental health and wellness for the first time. There's a lot of support for families around that. And the second I would say is where I used to work before I came to Rogers is Walker's Point Youth and Family Center. They're a shelter for youth ages 11 through 17, but they also offer counseling for free for ages 11 through 23. So that's late adolescence. And that can be really helpful if you're worried about insurance, or how much is this going to cost, or how much time is this going to take. My former colleague there, she's very knowledgeable. She's also a person of color. And so she's a great resource if people who are not quite sure, not quite sold on totally jumping into treatment. She's a great starting point, and there's no cost. So it's really inconsequential beyond just a person's time.
Great resources. Thank you. And when you're talking about telehealth, Paulina, just one thing I'd like to share that here in MCW does have a digital behavioral health program called Silver Cloud. That's something people can look into. It's a digital platform for mental health as well. So wanted to just close out this conversation now. Wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. Want to remind everyone on the call that there is still time to catch up on what we've been talking about around the Ugly Model documentary, and you can kind of validate things that we've been saying about this film in our conversation about self-image, self-esteem, the perceptions of beauty, and how that weighs upon somebody's mental health and their mental wellness. Thank you to Paulina Lim, Lauren Cheling Mascari, also Dr. David Sanko, and Gauchi Bang for sharing your wisdom with us. We're really fortunate to have you in our communities and providing the mental health support that our community needs, and helping to break down that stigma so people can access the care that they need without fear, without shame, and to really advance the wellness of all of our communities. So I wanted to thank you for that. So thank you everyone for joining the call, and hope you can access the resources that were shared and help us advance the wellness of our communities.
The 2020 Minority Health Film Festival offers a diverse variety of films and events that we just wouldn't be able to offer in the in-person cinema experience. But I think what really makes it unique is the focus not only on public health issues, but the issues that really concern communities of color. If you're looking for a reason to engage or to try it out, this is the perfect time. Just go to mkefilm.org/MHFF